Welcome. Find a comfortable position. Let the weight of the day settle away from your shoulders, and allow yourself to drift backward through time. Tonight, we journey to the 18th century, to one of history's darkest enterprises, the transatlantic slave trade. But we approach it from an angle often overlooked, through the eyes of the common sailor, pressed or tricked into service aboard vessels that brought misery to all who sailed them. This is not a story of adventure on the high seas. There were no romantic voyages here, no tales of maritime glory. Instead, imagine yourself as a young man from Bristol or Liverpool, perhaps taken by force from a tavern, perhaps desperate enough to sign articles you barely understood. You thought you were joining a merchant crew. What awaited you was something far different: a floating prison, where death rates among sailors often exceeded 20%, where disease claimed crew and captive alike, and where the psychological burden of participating in such an enterprise broke men's minds as surely as scurvy broke their bodies. Tonight, we will move slowly through this history. We will examine the daily reality of life aboard these vessels, the economic system that sustained them, the resistance that constantly threatened them, and the British cities that grew wealthy from their voyages. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of the narrative. The facts are grim, but they are important to understand. And from the comfort of the present, you can bear witness to a past that must be remembered, even as sleep gradually claims you. Breathe deeply. Let us begin. Imagine yourself in a dockside tavern in Liverpool in the year 1765. Air is thick with pipe smoke and the smell of cheap ale. You are 22 years old, strong enough for labor, but with few prospects. A well-dressed man approaches, speaks of good wages for a merchant voyage, and buys you another drink. By morning, you have signed articles you cannot now recall, agreeing to serve aboard a ship whose true purpose was obscured in the pleasant fog of alcohol and promises. Or perhaps there was no pretense at all. Perhaps you were simply pressed, taken by force from the streets or from another vessel, your protest meaningless against men with clubs and the legal authority of ship owners behind them. By the time you understood what kind of voyage this would be, the shore had already receded into the distance, and your fate was sealed for the next 6 to 8 months. The crew of a slave ship was not a chosen brotherhood. It was an assembly of the desperate, the deceived, and the coerced. Some men were experienced sailors fallen on hard times. Others had never seen the ocean before that first morning when they woke aboard ship, head throbbing, wrists bruised, and the coast of England growing faint on the horizon. You belonged to this latter group. The rhythm of your former life, whatever it had been, was already becoming dreamlike, unreal. The voyage to West Africa took weeks. During this time, you learned the brutal hierarchy of the ship. The captain was an absolute authority, his word law beyond any appeal. Below him were the mates and the surgeon, then the able seamen, and finally the common sailors like yourself, the lowest rung, the most expendable. The discipline was savage. Flogging was the standard punishment for infractions real or imagined. You witnessed a man receive 24 lashes for moving too slowly when called. The cat o' nine tails left his back a terrain of open flesh. You learned quickly to obey without hesitation, to make yourself invisible when possible, to speak only when required. The work was constant and exhausting. The ship had to be maintained, sails adjusted to catch every favorable wind, decks scrubbed, rigging repaired. Your hands, soft at the voyage's start, quickly became calloused and rope-burned. Salt spray stung the cracks in your skin. You learned to sleep in snatches, in whatever cramped corner you could claim, rocked by the ceaseless motion of the vessel through dark waters. But this first leg was the easiest part of the voyage. You did not yet know what awaited you. The ship anchored off the West African coast, near the Gold Coast or the Bight of Benin. Here, the true nature of your employment revealed itself fully. African merchants and European factors brought people to the shipmen, women and children taken in warfare, kidnapped from villages, or sold by rulers who participated in this commerce for guns, textiles, and alcohol. You watched as they were brought aboard. They were examined by the ship's surgeon, checked for signs of disease or physical weakness that might diminish their value. Those deemed suitable were branded, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the salt air, and taken below decks. Your stomach turned, but you said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not earn you the lash. The process took weeks, sometimes months. The ship remained anchored while its human cargo was gradually assembled. During this time, you were already falling ill. Malaria and yellow fever were endemic along the African coast, and European sailors had little resistance. You felt the first fever strike, the chills despite the tropical heat, the ache that settled deep in your bones. You were not alone. All around you, crew members sickened and died. According to records from this era, half of all European seamen who journeyed to West Africa in the 18th century died within a year. You survived, though you were never quite the same. The fever left you weakened, prone to recurring bouts of illness that would plague you for the remainder of the voyage. With the hold full, perhaps 400 people packed into spaces designed for cargo, not human beings, the ship set sail for the Americas. This was the Middle Passage, the second leg of the triangular trade, and it was here that the full horror of your situation became inescapable. Your primary duty was to help maintain control over hundreds of desperate, terrified people. Each morning, weather permitting, enslaved individuals were brought up on deck in small groups for exercise, a forced dancing in their chains, meant to prevent muscle atrophy and maintain their market value. You stood guard during these periods, armed with a whip or club, your role to ensure compliance and prevent any attempt at escape or revolt. The psychological burden of this work was crushing. These were people you could see the humanity in their eyes, the terror, the grief, the rage. Many refused to eat, preferring death to the unknown horror that awaited them. You were sometimes ordered to force feed them, using special instruments designed to pry open the mouths of the unwilling. The act made you complicit in their suffering in ways that haunted your sleep. The smell from the holds was beyond description. Hundreds of people confined in spaces 18 inches high, chained in positions that allowed neither standing nor comfortable lying, with inadequate sanitation. The result was an atmosphere so foul that crew members avoided descending into those depths whenever possible. But you did not always have a choice. When disease broke out, and it always broke out, the conditions worsened exponentially. Dysentery, the bloody flux, was the most common killer. It swept through the holds, leaving people lying in pools of their own waste, too weak to move, sometimes shackled to corpses for hours or days before the dead were discovered and removed. Smallpox, measles, and scurvy added to the death toll. The mortality rate among the enslaved during the Middle Passage was approximately 13 to 20%, though on some voyages it reached much higher. But you were not safe either. The same diseases that killed those below decks infected the crew. You contracted dysentery yourself, spending days in a feverish haze, barely able to perform your duties. Around you, shipmates died. The crew mortality rate was around 20% comparable to, or higher than that of the enslaved. The difference was one of scale and intent, but the ship was a death trap for all aboard. You lived in constant fear of uprising. The crew was vastly outnumbered, perhaps 20 or 30 sailors controlling 400 captives. If they managed to coordinate, to break their chains, to overpower the guards during the exercise periods, the crew would be overwhelmed in minutes. This fear was not unfounded. Revolts occurred on approximately 10% of all slave ship voyages. You heard stories from other sailors at the African ports, tales of ships where the enslaved had risen up, killed the crew, and attempted to sail back to Africa. The Amistad, though it would occur decades after your own voyage, became legendary for exactly this kind of revolt. The ship's design reflected this constant anxiety. Barricades divided sections of the deck, allowing the crew to retreat and fire down into the holds if necessary. Nets were strung around the sides of the ship to prevent captives from jumping overboard, and many attempted, preferring the ocean's depths to continued captivity. Weapons were always at hand, ready to suppress any sign of organized resistance. You participated in this system of control. You had no choice if you wished to survive. But the psychological cost was immense. Each night, when you finally collapsed into sleep, your dreams were filled with accusing eyes, with the sound of chains, with the imagined moment when the uprising would come and all the violence you had witnessed and perpetrated would be visited upon you. The officer's treatment of the crew was scarcely better than the treatment of the cargo. You were beaten regularly for minor infractions or perceived laziness. Food rations were inadequate, often spoiled. Fresh water was rationed to the point of constant thirst. The captain's interest was in maximizing profit, and crew welfare was not part of that calculation. In fact, you gradually realized a disturbing truth. A high crew mortality rate on the return voyage actually benefited the captain, as it reduced the number of sailors who had to be paid upon reaching the home port. You began to understand that your life had little more value than the lives of those in the hold. You were all commodities in a vast, cruel economic machine. The middle passage lasted 6 to 10 weeks, depending on weather and currents. Each day felt endless. You performed your duties mechanically, your mind retreating to some protected inner space to escape the reality of your circumstances. You witnessed things that would mark you permanently, acts of cruelty that became routine, suffering so vast it numbed you to further suffering. When land finally appeared, the Caribbean islands or the American coast, you felt relief mixed with a deeper shame. You had survived. Many had not. Of your original crew, several had died of disease. One had been killed during a minor revolt, and one had simply vanished one night, likely gone overboard by his own choice or another's hand. In port, the enslaved were taken ashore and sold at auction. You helped unload them, seeing them stumble on legs unused to solid ground, blinking in sunlight after weeks in darkness. Their trauma was visible in every movement. Your own trauma was less visible, but no less real. The ship took on cargo for the return voyage: sugar, tobacco, rum, cotton, the products of plantation labor. This third leg of the triangular trade was theoretically the easiest, but you were so weakened by disease and malnutrition that it felt no easier than the middle passage itself. After 6 to 8 months, the ship returned to Liverpool or Bristol. You had survived, but barely. Your wages, promised to be generous, turned out to be meager after various deductions the captain claimed were owed. Many sailors were simply cheated outright, arriving home penniless after months of hell. You were permanently changed. The voyage had broken something in you, a basic faith in humanity, perhaps, or simply the innocence that allows a person to sleep peacefully. You had seen and done things that could not be forgotten. Many sailors who survived such voyages became heavy drinkers, trying to drown the memories. Others simply disappeared into the margins of society, unable to reintegrate into normal life. And the most bitter knowledge of all, the enterprise would continue. Other ships were already preparing for their own voyages, other sailors being recruited or pressed into service. The system that had nearly killed you was thriving, growing, and reaching the very cities whose taverns and streets you now walked like a ghost of your former self. Looking back, what stayed with you most was not any single horror, but the relentless, grinding nature of it all. Day after day, week after week, the same duties, the same suffering, the same despair. Life aboard a slave ship had a terrible rhythm, the routine of cruelty, the predictable progression of disease, the mechanical process of reducing human beings to cargo and sailors to the instruments of that reduction. You would never go to sea again. The wages you had earned, what little remained after being cheated, were not worth the cost. Your body was weakened, your mind scarred, your conscience burdened with participation in an enterprise you now recognized as monstrous. You had learned what you would not survive again, The Middle Passage broke everyone it touched, though in different ways and different degrees. The ship that had carried you was already preparing for another voyage, but without you. Let that be someone else's nightmare now. You had served your time in that floating hell, and if you were fortunate, you might find some way to live with the memories until they finally, mercifully, faded into the quiet darkness of forgotten things. Let yourself drift now from the immediate horror of a single voyage to the broader system that sustained it. The triangular trade was not a haphazard enterprise or a series of isolated transactions. It was a carefully structured economic network that spanned 3 continents and operated for more than 4 centuries, transporting an estimated 12 million Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. The numbers are so vast, they become abstract, almost meaningless. But each number represented a person, a life, a lineage interrupted. The system functioned with the precision of any well-designed commercial venture. 3 legs formed the triangle, each serving a specific economic purpose, each feeding into the next with the inexorable logic of profit. Ships departed from ports like Bristol, Liverpool, London, Nantes, and later Boston, loaded with manufactured goods. These were not luxury items, but practical commodities designed to appeal to African merchants and rulers. Textiles, cotton cloth, linen, woolens, metal goods, brass pans, iron bars, copper rods, weapons, muskets, gunpowder, swords, alcohol, rum, and brandy, glass beads, and other decorative items. The value of these goods was modest by European standards, but their appeal in West African markets made them effective currency for the trade that followed. The first leg of the journey typically took 6 to 8 weeks, following established trade winds southward along the European and African coasts. During this period, the ship's crew was at its healthiest and most numerous. The captain's primary concerns were weather, navigation, and maintaining discipline. The hold was filled with crates and barrels, not yet with human beings. It was, in many ways, an ordinary merchant voyage, except for what awaited at journey's end. Upon reaching the West African coast, primarily the regions known as the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, the Bight of Benin, and the Bight of Biafra, the ship anchored and began the process of exchange. This was not a simple transaction, but often a prolonged negotiation that could take weeks or months. European traders dealt with African merchants, local rulers, and specialized brokers who controlled access to enslaved people. The relationship was not one of European dominance during the actual exchange. On the African coast, local powers held considerable authority and negotiating leverage. They set prices, determined terms, and could refuse traders who did not meet their expectations. The enslaved people brought to the coast came from various sources. Many were prisoners captured during wars between African kingdoms and states. The demand created by European traders incentivized these conflicts, turning warfare into a profitable enterprise for those with the military power to wage it. The Ashanti Kingdom of present-day Ghana, the Bambara Empire in Malai, and the Kingdom of Dahomey all participated actively in capturing and selling people to European traders. Others were kidnapped by raiding parties specifically organized to supply the trade. Villages might be attacked at night, their inhabitants taken by force. Still others were enslaved through judicial processes. People convicted of crimes or unable to pay debts found themselves sold to coastal traders. The definitions of crime and debt were sometimes manipulated to supply the insatiable demand. The system corrupted societies wherever it touched. Traditional forms of slavery existed in Africa before European contact, but the transatlantic trade transformed them into something far more destructive. The scale was unprecedented: millions of people extracted from the continent over 4 centuries. The social fabric of entire regions was torn apart. Young, able-bodied individuals were disproportionately taken, leaving communities depleted of their most productive members. European goods, particularly firearms, further destabilized the region. Kingdoms that refused to participate in the slave trade found themselves at a military disadvantage against neighbors who used European weapons acquired through slave sales. A terrible arms race developed. Participate in the trade to obtain guns or become vulnerable to those who did. The second leg of the triangle, the middle passage, we have already examined through the eyes of a sailor. But from an economic perspective, this voyage represented the crucial transformation of European manufactured goods into a far more valuable commodity, human laborers whose entire lives could be exploited. The mortality rate during this crossing, approximately 13 to 20%, was factored into the business model as an acceptable loss. Ship captains packed their vessels as tightly as possible, calculating that even with significant deaths en route, the number of survivors would maximize profit. This calculus treated human death as simply a predictable cost of doing business, no different from spoilage in a shipment of grain. Insurance policies were taken out on the human cargo, protecting investors against loss. Lloyd's of London and other insurance companies built substantial businesses underwriting slave voyages, developing actuarial tables that assessed risk based on ship condition, captain experience, and route. The insurance of slave voyages themselves accounted for an estimated 5 to 10% of total marine insurance premiums in 18th century Britain. Some policies covered death from natural causes, disease, suicide by starvation, while others excluded or charged extra premiums for losses due to revolt or rebellion. The very language of these documents reveals the complete dehumanization inherent in the system. People were classified as cargo, valued like bales of cloth or barrels of rum, their lives reduced to insured commodities. After 6 to 10 weeks at sea, the ship arrived at its destination in the Caribbean, Brazil, or the American colonies. The enslaved were brought ashore and prepared for sale. This process could take various forms. Public auctions where individuals and families were sold to the highest bidder, private sales arranged in advance with plantation owners, or scrambles where buyers paid a fixed price and then literally rushed to claim the people they wanted. The prices varied based on age, sex, apparent physical condition, and market demand. A healthy young man in his prime might sell for the equivalent of several years' wages for an English laborer. A woman's value was often calculated based on her perceived capacity for both labor and reproduction. Children were sold at discounted rates, their future productivity speculative. The cash or credit from these sales formed the basis of the third leg's cargo purchase. Plantation owners, enriched by the labor of previously enslaved people, bought sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum, molasses, and other cash crops from current enslaved laborers to ship back to Europe. The system was self-perpetuating. Slavery produced wealth that purchased more enslaved people to produce more wealth. The third leg carried agricultural products back to European ports. Sugar from Caribbean plantations, tobacco from Virginia, cotton from the American South, rum distilled from molasses. These were the tangible products of enslaved labor that European consumers purchased, often with little thought about their origins. The entire circuit Europe to Africa to America to Europe took approximately 1 year on average. The profits were extraordinary. Returns of 100% or more on initial investment were common, though not guaranteed. Some voyages ended in disaster. Ships lost to storms, cargoes decimated by disease, revolts that resulted in total loss. But across many voyages, the average profits were sufficient to make the trade enormously attractive to investors. These profits flowed into European economies, providing capital for further investment, funding the early stages of industrialization, building family fortunes that persisted for generations. The wealth extracted from African bodies and American land created the financial foundation for much of the modern Western economy. The triangular trade required substantial capital. A ship had to be purchased or chartered, outfitted with appropriate goods for the African exchange, supplied with food and water for several months at sea, and staffed with a crew. The costs were beyond the means of most individual merchants, leading to the development of sophisticated investment structures. Shares in voyages were sold to multiple investors, spreading both risk and profit. A merchant might invest in several voyages simultaneously, ensuring that the failure of one would not mean financial ruin. Banks provided loans against the expected returns. Insurance companies, as mentioned, covered various categories of risk. Entire financial networks developed around the slave trade. The same institutions that financed slave voyages also provided mortgages, business loans, and other financial services to the broader economy. The profits from the trade permeated the economic system, becoming impossible to fully separate from legitimate commerce. The numbers, when fully examined, are staggering. Over the 4 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade, approximately 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. The actual number captured was higher, perhaps 15 to 18 million, with millions dying in the march to the coast, during the wait in coastal barracoons, or during the Middle Passage itself. The peak period was the 18th century, when British, French, Portuguese, and Dutch traders transported hundreds of thousands of people annually. In some years, more than 80,000 individuals crossed the Atlantic in chains. The logistics of organizing such mass deportation required bureaucratic systems, record-keeping, specialized ship designs, and trained personnel. It was, in a grim sense, one of the early examples of industrial-scale organization applied to human trafficking. Those who profited from the triangular trade developed elaborate justifications for their enterprise. Enslaved Africans were described as naturally suited for labor in tropical climates, or as benefiting from Christian civilization despite their bondage, or as already enslaved in Africa, and thus merely transferred between different masters. These arguments were repeated, so often they acquired a veneer of respectability. The contradiction between the European Enlightenment's rhetoric of liberty and natural rights and the simultaneous enslavement of millions was addressed through the simple expedient of defining enslaved Africans as outside the category of full humanity. Legal systems categorized them as property, not persons. Philosophical treatises on freedom and dignity excluded them from consideration. The cognitive dissonance was resolved through dehumanization so complete that merchants could trade in human beings while considering themselves moral, even pious, individuals. The economic dependency. By the mid-18th century, entire sectors of European and American economies depended on the continuation of the slave trade and slavery. Caribbean sugar plantations produced enormous wealth, but required constant replacement of enslaved laborers, whose life expectancy under brutal working conditions might be only 7 to 10 years after arrival. The demand for new captives never ceased. The British economy, in particular, became deeply entwined with slavery-related commerce. Slavery-related business overall accounted for between 1/3 and 40% of marine insurance premium income in the second half of the 18th century. The textile industry relied on slave-grown cotton. The tobacco trade was entirely dependent on slave labor. Sugar consumption, which increased dramatically during this period, was sustained by slavery. When abolitionists later began arguing for the end of the slave trade and slavery itself, they faced fierce opposition, not merely from moral conservatism, but from entrenched economic interests that calculated their wealth would be diminished by emancipation. The system had become so integrated into the economy that many believed it could not be dismantled without causing economic collapse. Beyond the immediate victims, the 12 million transported, the millions who died in the process, the triangular trade inflicted intergenerational trauma that persists to the present day. Children born into slavery inherited their mother's status, ensuring that the system reproduced itself across generations. Families were deliberately separated to prevent solidarity and resistance. Cultural knowledge, languages, traditional practices were suppressed. The descendants of enslaved people carry the legacy of this history, the stolen centuries of labor that built wealth for others while impoverishing their own ancestors. The cultural disruption that severed connections to specific African origins the ongoing effects of systematic dehumanization embedded in social structures and attitudes. The descendants of slave traders, by contrast, often inherited wealth, social position, and opportunities built directly or indirectly on slavery's profits. This unequal distribution of historical advantage and disadvantage continues to shape life chances in measurable ways. Wealth gaps, educational disparities, differential treatment in legal and social systems. The triangular trade can be reduced to cold mathematics. Investment plus goods plus ships plus enslaved people minus mortality plus sale price minus costs equals profit. The equation worked financially for those who controlled the capital. It generated wealth on a scale that transformed economies and funded the development of modern capitalism. But the same mathematics reveals a profound moral bankruptcy. Each percentage point of profit was extracted from human suffering. Each successful voyage represented hundreds of lives destroyed, families torn apart, communities depleted. The numbers in account books translated to whipped scars on human backs, to chains worn until flesh gave way to bone, to the faces of children sold away from their mothers, to the deliberate breaking of human spirits in service of agricultural production. The system operated for 4 centuries because it was profitable, and because those who profited held the power to continue it despite the moral arguments that gradually accumulated against it. Economics, not ethics, drove the trade. And when eventually ethics prevailed through the tireless work of abolitionists and the resistance of enslaved people themselves, the transition took decades and left many of the underlying economic inequalities intact. Let this understanding settle over you like a heavy blanket. The triangular trade was not an aberration or an accident, but a logical outgrowth of an economic system that valued profit over human dignity. It operated with the efficiency of any successful business, with careful planning, financial sophistication, and international coordination. From your comfortable position in the present, with the warmth of your bed and the security of your freedom, you can contemplate this history, knowing that it has ended, at least in this specific legal form. The ships no longer sail this particular route. The auction blocks have been removed. The formal system has been dismantled, though its legacy persists in ways both visible and hidden. As you rest more deeply into the story, let the perspective shift. The Middle Passage is often described only as a one-sided horror, but even in the most controlled and violent conditions, people resisted. The holds of slave ships were not silent. They were spaces of whispered planning, quiet refusal, and at times, open rebellion. Historians estimate that some form of organized resistance or revolt occurred on roughly 1 in 10 slave ship voyages. The exact percentage shifts slightly in different studies. Some suggest 8%, others 10 or a bit more, but all agree. Resistance was not rare or exceptional. It was a constant possibility that shaped how the entire system operated. This means that on the imaginary dock where dozens of slave ships lie at anchor, you could look down the line and know that several of those vessels would, at some point, face the terrifying and hopeful reality of revolt. Rebellions did not arise from nowhere. They emerged from specific combinations of conditions: overcrowding, brutal treatment, and moments when the balance of power briefly shifted. When disease thinned the crew, when storms distracted officers, when groups of captives with shared languages and histories were held together, the chances of revolt increased. Some regions produced more shipboard uprisings than others. Captives taken from Senegambia, for example, accounted for a small portion of the overall trade, about 4.5%, but were involved in roughly 22% of known shipboard revolts. This suggests strong political and military traditions among certain West African societies, and perhaps pre-existing forms of organization that could be adapted to resistance at sea. Where captives from West Central Africa made up about 44% of the trade, they were involved in roughly 11% of revolts, a lower rate, but still significant. These numbers remind you that enslaved people were not a single passive mass. They came from varied societies, with different experiences of warfare, leadership, and community organization. Those experiences traveled with them into the dark holds of the ships. Not all resistance was dramatic or violent. Some of it was quiet, steady, and deeply personal. Enslaved people refused food, seeking to die on their own terms rather than live as someone else's property. In response, crews used force-feeding devices, trying to turn even a person's own body into an asset to be preserved rather than a life to be respected. Others attempted to leap overboard when allowed on deck, choosing the ocean over the plantation. Nets were stretched along the sides to prevent this, but still, some found ways through or over them. Each attempt, even when prevented, reminded the crew that their control was never complete. There were acts of sabotage, tools hidden, equipment damaged, fire sometimes set in small spaces. Stories circulated among sailors of captives who loosened bolts or tampered with chains, testing the boundaries of their confinement. These acts might not overturn the ship's regime, but they disrupted it, forced the crew to remain constantly vigilant, and asserted that the people in the hold were not fully subdued. Enslaved people also resisted by maintaining aspects of their cultures, whispering prayers, singing in low voices when they could, braiding hair, sharing memories of home. These acts did not threaten the ship physically, but they preserved identity and dignity under conditions designed to erase both. In a world that treated them as cargo, to remember one's own humanity was itself a form of defiance. Organizing an uprising on a slave ship required extraordinary coordination. Captives were chained, often separated by language, confined in darkness, under constant surveillance. Yet, communication still flowed. People found ways to speak in whispers when guards turned their attention elsewhere. Gestures, glances, and small signals passed along narrow, crowded spaces. Those who shared a language or regional origin often took the lead, but alliances could form across those boundaries, united by a common purpose, not to submit quietly to a future of forced labor. Information traveled with the captives themselves. Some had been held for long periods at coastal barracoons or trading forts, and had already heard rumors of what awaited them across the ocean. Others had been transported on earlier voyages and were being reshipped after intermediate stops. Through these channels, knowledge of particular captains, notorious ships, and the possibility of revolt circulated from one group to another. The timing of an uprising was critical. A revolt too early, near the African coast, gave a better chance of returning to land if control of the ship could be seized. A revolt in mid-ocean carried the risk of being trapped on a vessel without the skills to navigate. Some uprisings targeted the moment just after leaving port, when crew routines were still settling and vigilance might be slightly relaxed. When open rebellion occurred, it often took advantage of the ship's routines. Early morning, when only a few guards were on duty. Meal distribution, when chains might be loosened. Times of rough weather, when crew attention was more focused on the ship's safety than the hold. The captives' weapons were often improvised. Chains used as bludgeons, loose iron bars, wooden staves, kitchen knives, or tools seized from unsuspecting sailors. In some cases, they managed to get hold of firearms or even cannons. On the ship Little George, for example, captives attacked in the early hours of the morning, overpowered the two men on guard, loaded a cannon, and fired it at the crew. They then sailed the vessel up the Sierra Leone River and escaped, while the surviving crew drifted in a small boat for days, living on raw rice until rescue. Not every plan succeeded. Some plots were discovered in advance, reported by informants, or detected by observant crew members. When that happened, the punishment was swift and brutal leaders executed, others tortured as a warning. The holds became quieter afterward, but the silence did not necessarily mean acceptance. It often meant grieving, regrouping, waiting for another opportunity. Although it occurred near the end of the Atlantic slave trade, the revolt aboard the Spanish schooner La Amistad in 1839 became one of the most famous examples of shipboard resistance. The people involved had already endured so much. They were seized in Sierra Leone by Portuguese slave hunters, held with hundreds of others, then transported unlawfully to Havana, despite British efforts to suppress the trade. From Havana, 53 of them were loaded onto the Amistad, bound for another part of Cuba. The conditions were harsh, the treatment brutal. 4 days into the voyage, one man, Seng BP, known in the U.S. as Joseph Sink, managed to free himself from his chains. He then released others. They armed themselves with whatever they could find, including sugarcane knives. In the uprising that followed, they killed the ship's cook and the captain. 2 captives also died in the struggle. They spared 2 Spanish crew members, ordering them to navigate the ship back to Africa. Instead, the surviving crew sailed north and west, hoping to reach the United States. After weeks at sea, the Amistad was seized off the coast of Long Island by an American naval vessel. What followed was unusual, a prolonged legal case in the United States. The captives were imprisoned and tried, but eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that they had been illegally enslaved and had the right to fight for their freedom. Many were finally returned to Africa. The case became a symbol for abolitionists, proof that enslaved Africans were not passive victims, but actors asserting their own rights, even under extraordinary duress. 2 years later, in 1841, another significant revolt took place aboard the American brig Creole. Unlike typical Middle Passage voyages, this ship was involved in the internal U.S. coastwise slave trade, transporting 128 enslaved people from Virginia to New Orleans. Conditions were still harsh, and the captives understood that a sale in New Orleans likely meant permanent separation from family and even harsher labor regimes. On November 7th, a group of enslaved men, led by Madison Washington, rose up. They overpowered the crew, killed one of the slave traders, and wounded the captain. Some crew members fled into the rigging to escape. One enslaved man was badly wounded and later died. Eventually, the rebels forced the ship to sail to Nassau in the Bahamas, a British colony where slavery had been abolished. There, British authorities declared the enslaved people free under British law, sparking diplomatic tension between the United States and Britain. The Creole Revolt has been described as the most successful slave revolt in U.S. history, in the sense that the majority of those involved gained their freedom. It demonstrated that even when the legal and political frameworks of slavery seemed solid, specific actions at sea could create unexpected openings. Fear of rebellion shaped the very design of slave ships. Over time, captains and shipbuilders adapted vessels specifically for this trade, using architecture as a form of weaponized control. Ships were equipped with barricades or bulkheads on deck, creating defensible positions from which armed crew could fire down on any uprising below. Heavy wooden gratings over the hatchways, allowing air and some light to enter the hold while restricting movement and making it easier to guard access points. Netting or fighting nets strung along the sides, meant to prevent captives from climbing overboard or boarding parties from approaching unnoticed. Strategic storage of weapons with muskets and cutlasses kept near officers' quarters, ready for rapid deployment at any hint of trouble. These features turned the ship into a moving fortress, designed not just for sailing, but for suppressing the people trapped within it. Yet, even with all this, rebellion still occurred, a measure of how strong the desire for freedom remained. When revolts did occur and were not immediately successful, the response was often grotesquely severe. Captains understood that their authority depended on making examples. Those identified as leaders could be executed and their bodies displayed as warnings. Others might be chained more heavily, denied what little movement they had, or subjected to prolonged torment. The details of such punishments are often too disturbing to linger on, but the pattern is clear. The goal was not simply to restore order, but to break the will of any potential future rebels. Yet even after such episodes, resistance rarely disappeared entirely. It moved back into quieter forms, into the sharing of information, into small acts of refusal, into the determination to survive long enough to find another opportunity. The possibility of revolt weighed heavily on both captives and crew. For enslaved people, planning an uprising involved immense risk. Failure meant torture and death. Success offered freedom, but also danger, especially if the ship was far from land or if they lacked navigational knowledge. For the crew, every creak of the ship at night, every small sound from the hold, could provoke anxiety. A vessel with hundreds of people in chains below, outnumbering the crew many times over, was never a place of true security. This constant tension contributed to the harsh discipline, the readiness to use extreme violence at any sign of defiance. Some sailors, already traumatized by the general brutality of the trade, found the prospect of a revolt terrifying. Others may have felt a complicated sympathy for the rebels, recognizing in them not enemies, but fellow victims of a system that also treated sailors as disposable. The historical record preserves mostly official accounts, captains' reports, insurers' notes, but between the lines, you can sense the uneasy atmosphere aboard these ships. The existence of shipboard revolts challenges the image of enslaved Africans as passive objects of history. Even in the most constrained circumstances imaginable, chained, starved, terrorized, far from home, many still tried to shape their own destinies. They organized, planned, took risks, and sometimes won. Revolts forced slavers and investors to confront the reality that their cargo was not, in fact, cargo. It was composed of human beings with agency, intelligence, and a willingness to fight. Every insurrection, successful or not, exposed the fundamental lie at the heart of the system, that people could be reduced to property without resistance. Fear of revolt also increased the costs of the trade. More guards were needed, more weapons, more architectural modifications, higher insurance premiums for voyages deemed risky. In subtle ways, resistance eroded the efficiency of the enterprise. It did not end the trade on its own, but it complicated and undermined it. As you let these stories settle in your mind, you could imagine the Atlantic not just as a graveyard of ships and bodies, but also as a vast space of struggle. The ocean carried not only suffering, but also acts of courage, desperate hope, and determined refusal. Even when the horizon was empty, and the ship seemed an isolated universe, the human spirit inside its wooden walls did not entirely submit. The next part of this journey will move us from the ships themselves to the ports that sent them out and welcomed them home. Places like Bristol and Liverpool, where the wealth generated by this system took visible form in stone and brick. For now, remain in the gentle rhythm of the waves in your imagination, the creak of masts, the distant calls as the scene gradually shifts from open water to crowded harbors. Breathe slowly. Feel the story stretching out behind you and ahead of you, and allow your thoughts to drift with it. Let your mind drift now from the open Atlantic to the protected waters of two busy 18th century harbors. The creak of the slave ship fades into the sounds of crowded docks, carts rattling over cobblestones, shipwrights' hammers striking wood, gulls calling overhead. You are approaching Bristol and Liverpool, two British cities whose fortunes rose on the currents of the slave trade. From a distance, they appear prosperous and orderly. Church spires rise above rows of townhouses. Warehouses line the waterfront, their brick faces solid and respectable. To a casual eye, there is nothing here to suggest misery. Yet much of the money that built these facades came directly from the voyages you have just imagined. The same triangular circuit of goods, captives, and plantation produce. In the late 17th century, Bristol was already an important English port, but its role expanded dramatically after 1698, when the Royal African Company's monopoly over the slave trade was broken under pressure from groups including Bristol's Society of Merchant Venturers. These merchants, an exclusive organization of the city's wealthiest traders, had long desired direct access to African commerce. Once the monopoly ended, Bristol's involvement was swift and extensive. By the mid-18th century, it had become Britain's dominant slave trading port, surpassing London for a time. Between the late 17th and early 19th centuries, Bristol merchants sent hundreds of slaving voyages to West Africa, carrying tens of thousands of captives across the Atlantic. The profits reached deep into the city's economy. Not only ship owners, but also investors, shipbuilders, rope makers, coopers, metal workers, and dock laborers benefited from the employment and contracts generated by the trade. Refineries processed slave-grown sugar. Tobacco warehouses stored slave-produced leaves. Chocolate makers used cacao from plantations. The slave trade and slavery underpinned multiple layers of local industry. Estimates suggest that by the late 1780s, Bristol was earning about £525,000 per year from slave-related commercial activities, a very substantial sum for the period. This figure came after Bristol's peak participation, implying that earlier decades may have yielded even greater annual returns. The wealth did not spread evenly. It concentrated in the hands of merchant families who used it to build townhouses, buy country estates, and secure positions of civic authority. At the center of this world stood the Society of Merchant Venturers, an elite guild of traders who organized much of Bristol's commercial life. Members owned ships, invested in voyages, and took leadership roles in city government. They presented themselves as respectable gentlemen, patrons of churches and charities, guardians of civic virtue. Yet many of them built their fortunes on the buying and selling of human beings. The society actively lobbied for the right to participate in the slave trade, and later opposed abolitionist efforts that threatened their income. They were not shadowy figures operating on the margins of legality. They were central, celebrated members of Bristol society. Their influence extended to how the city told its own story. For generations, Bristol's official narratives emphasized exploration, trade, and maritime skill, while minimizing the role of slavery. In this way, the physical evidence of wealth, the grand houses, the endowed institutions remained visible, while the source of that wealth stayed largely unspoken. Farther north along the Irish Sea, Liverpool underwent an even more dramatic transformation. In the early 1700s, it was a modest port, overshadowed by older rivals. By the end of the century, it had become one of the richest trading centers in the world, a rise many historians attribute primarily to the slave trade. A Liverpool historian writing in 1907 stated that, beyond a doubt, it was the slave trade that raised Liverpool from a struggling port to be one of the richest and most prosperous trading centers of the world. Another contemporaneous writer remarked that in Liverpool, every brick is cemented to its fellow brick by the blood and sweat of Negroes. These were not abolitionist exaggerations, but reflections of a widely recognized reality. Liverpool merchants quickly came to dominate the British slave trade. At certain points in the late 18th century, they controlled the majority of British voyages, sending hundreds of ships to Africa and the Americas. The city's docks, including the later famous Albert Dock, were deeply connected to Atlantic commerce, including the import of sugar, cotton, and tobacco grown by enslaved labor. The wealth generated supported an array of civic and cultural projects. Liverpool's philanthropic institutions, prestigious schools, public parks, and fine civic buildings often had direct or indirect links to fortunes made in slavery-related trades. Donations from slave-trading families endowed hospitals, churches, and educational foundations, embedding the profits of the trade in the city's moral and cultural life. One building is often singled out as the clearest architectural monument to Liverpool's involvement in the trade. Liverpool Town Hall. Constructed between 1749 and 1754, it was designed by architect John Wood of Bath. The hall's exterior includes a sculpted frieze featuring African faces, elephants, crocodiles, and lions, deliberate references to the African trade that underpinned the city's prosperity. The families behind the town hall's construction, such as the Earls, Cunliffes, Haywoods, and Blundells, were prominent slave traders during the mid-18th century. Between 1787 and 1807, every mayor of Liverpool had ties to the slave trade. City governance and slavery were tightly interwoven. Beyond the town hall, many of Liverpool's churches and charitable buildings were funded by merchants involved in the Virginia trade, tobacco grown by enslaved people, and the broader Atlantic economy. St. Peter's Church and St. George's, for example, were associated with Sir Thomas Johnson, a figure deeply involved in these trades. The physical fabric of the city, its most admired buildings, thus became a form of unmarked memorial to enslaved labor. Street names echoed this history. Roads and districts bore the names of families and individuals who owned ships, plantations, or both. For most passers-by, these names were simply part of the urban landscape, their origins unexamined. In both Bristol and Liverpool, the slave trade supported a web of related industries. Ships had to be built, repaired, and outfitted. This gave steady work to shipwrights, carpenters, sailmakers, rope makers, and ironmongers. Dock laborers loaded and unloaded cargoes. Warehouse workers handled sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton. Refiners, distillers, and manufacturers processed these imports into goods for domestic consumption or re-export. Banks provided credit to merchants, allowing them to finance voyages and plantation operations. Insurance companies, including Lloyd's and others, underwrote risk, charging fees that became a significant part of their business. Legal professionals handled contracts, inheritance disputes, and the complexities of transatlantic property claims, including claims over enslaved people. This network meant that many people who never set foot on a slave ship or plantation still participated in and benefited from the system. A cooper making barrels in Bristol, a clerk at a Liverpool counting house, a refiner processing sugar in an inland town, all were connected, through chains of commerce, to the labor of enslaved Africans. One reason these cities could remain proud and outwardly respectable was the geographic distance from the plantation fields and shipboard horrors. In Bristol and Liverpool, residents saw the arriving casks of sugar, the bales of cotton, the barrels of rum. They saw wealth in tangible form: fine clothes, imported delicacies, grand houses. They did not see the whip, the chains, or the cramped holds. For many, the suffering that underpinned this prosperity remained abstract. It could be mentioned, justified, or ignored as circumstances required. Some merchants may have visited plantations or spent time in the Caribbean, but many remained in Britain, dealing only with ledgers and letters. Their children grew up in comfort, with little reason to question the source of their family's fortune. This detachment made it easier to construct narratives that focused on enterprise and commerce rather than exploitation. Merchant families portrayed themselves as hardworking, innovative, and generous benefactors of their cities. And in a narrow sense, that was true. They did help build schools, hospitals, and civic institutions. But the funds used to do so often had their origins in the unpaid labor and suffering of enslaved people thousands of miles away. When abolitionist movements gained strength in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many Bristol and Liverpool merchants opposed them fiercely. The Society of Merchant Venturers in Bristol, for example, used its political influence to resist efforts to end the trade, arguing that abolition would devastate the local economy and undermine Britain's commercial strength. In Liverpool, slaving interests were similarly vocal. Pamphlets, petitions, and parliamentary lobbying campaigns sought to preserve the trade. The merchants' argument was straightforward: too many jobs, too much capital, too much infrastructure depended on the Atlantic system. They presented themselves as defenders of national prosperity. This resistance delayed abolition and ensured that the trade continued longer than it otherwise might have. Even after Britain legally abolished the slave trade in 1807, and slavery itself in most of the empire in the 1830s, compensation was paid not to formerly enslaved people, but to slave owners, many of whom were connected to the same merchant families in ports like Bristol and Liverpool. Financial losses were thus cushioned for those who had benefited most, while those who had suffered most received nothing. In the present, both cities continue to wrestle with this legacy. Museums, plaques, and educational programs have begun to address more directly the role of slavery in their development. Exhibits in local museums explore the lives of enslaved people, the workings of the trade, and the ways that wealth flowed into civic institutions. Street names and statues have become points of contention. Across the UK, including in London's financial district, new plaques have been added to statues of figures like William Beckford and Sir John Cass, explicitly acknowledging their involvement in slavery and condemning their actions. The approach has been described as retain and explain, keeping monuments in place but adding context that makes their histories clear. In Liverpool and Bristol, similar debates have unfolded. Some argue that monuments and street names honoring slave traders should be removed or renamed. Others prefer contextualization rather than erasure. The broader public conversation reflects a growing recognition that much British wealth, especially in certain regions and sectors, was built on this foundation, and that acknowledging this truth is a necessary step toward a more honest understanding of national history. Imagine yourself now walking through modern Bristol or Liverpool. The streets are busy with cars and buses. Cafes and shops line the pavements. Most people you pass are engaged in the concerns of daily life: work, family, small pleasures. The buildings around you appear simply old and picturesque, part of the familiar urban landscape. Yet, with the history in mind, you begin to see layered meanings. A grand Georgian townhouse suggests not just architectural elegance, but the possibility that its first owner invested in voyages like the ones you have heard described. A church commemorating a philanthropic merchant prompts you to wonder whether his donations came from plantation profits. A civic building with carved African faces in its stonework ceases to be neutral decoration and becomes instead a reminder of a time when such imagery signified commercial pride in the African trade. The knowledge does not physically change the stones beneath your feet, but it subtly alters how you inhabit the space. As this segment draws to a close, the connection between the ship, the plantation, and the city becomes clearer. The horrors of the Middle Passage did not end at the water's edge. They continued in the fields of the Caribbean and the Americas, and then translated into wealth that shaped European urban landscapes, institutions, and social hierarchies. Lying in your bed now, you are far from the docks of Bristol and Liverpool, far from the creaking slave ships of the 18th century. Yet the world you inhabit has been influenced, in ways both subtle and profound, by that history. To recognize this is not to deny the comforts of the present, but to understand that they are layered over the struggles of the past. Breathe slowly. Let the images of ships, harbors, and city streets drift further away, like a coastline fading into mist. The narrative that began with a single sailor on a slave ship has widened to encompass entire economic systems and urban landscapes. Soon, it will narrow again into a gentle closing reflection.